Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for today's Tech Forum session. I'm Ainsley Sparks, the Marketing and Communications Manager at BookNet Canada. Welcome to Foreign Object in the House of Canadian Literature. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to recognize that BookNet Canada acknowledges its staff, board, and partners work upon the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Huron Indigenous peoples, the original nations of this land. We endorse the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and support an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space making in the book industry. Now, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Leonika Valcius. Leonika is a literary agent at Transatlantic Agency, representing commercial and genre fiction for adults and children. As the founder of #DiverseCanLit and the former chair of the Festival of Literary Diversity, working with writers of color is a key part of her mandate. Leonika previously worked on the online and digital sales team at Penguin Random House Canada, as a French book buyer for Scholastic Book Fairs Canada, and as a book sales and marketing instructor at Centennial College. And now I'll pass it over to Leonika to introduce our panelists.
Hello, hello. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm going to trust that you can. Thank you so much for having me, Tech Forum. It's always lovely to be in this space. And even though we're doing it from afar this time, I'm really excited for this conversation. Now, to set some context for all of you who are attending, I want to say that this is not a diversity and inclusion panel. So if that was your expectation, we're sorry, but not that sorry to disappoint. I don't talk about diversity in publishing anymore. That hamster wheel got boring pretty quickly, so I hopped off. I would be interested in talking about power and resources and how those can be redistributed throughout the industry. But considering the news of the past few months and the consistent consolidation of power and resources within the industry, I don't think we're ready for that conversation. So instead, we're going to have a conversation that I think is applicable right now, and I think is pretty low-hanging fruit that all of us within the industry can apply to our practices and processes immediately. This conversation is about agency and boundaries. It's about dignity and empathy. It's about how we treat writers who are the linchpin of our entire industry. And I can't think of two better people to discuss this with. Dashtgard is a renowned author, changemaker, and co-founder of Anima Leadership, a boutique consulting company specializing in issues of diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism. Previously, she was a leader in the economic globalization movement, responsible for several political campaigns, and frequently referred to as one of the top activists to watch. Her published writing credits include the Globe and Mail, CBC, and numerous magazines. Her first book, Breaking the Ocean, a memoir of race, rebellion, and reconciliation, garnered stellar reviews, referred to as a luminous inventory dappled with joy and pain by Quill and Choir. Dashtgard is currently working on her second book, Bones of Belonging, a collection of stories linking the personal to the political. Now, when I read Anahid's beautiful piece, which I hope you all had an opportunity to read, the one that is the namesake for this panel, I really felt that there is so much that she illuminated about her experiences from her first book tour, and she highlights the failings of our current approach. Now, my colleague Shailene Knight is also here with us. Shailene is the author of Braided Skin and the memoir Dear Current Occupant, winner of the 2018 Vancouver Book Award, and longlisted for the George Riga Award for Social Awareness in Literature. Her essays have appeared in multiple Canadian and American literary journals, plus the Globe and Mail, the Walrus, and the Toronto Star. Her work is anthologized in Making Room, Love Me True, Sustenance, The Summer Book, and Black Writers Matter. Winner of the 2020 Saskatchewan Book Award. The Toronto Star called Knight one of the storytellers we need most right now. Knight was the previous managing editor at Room Magazine and the previous festival director for the Growing Room Festival in Vancouver. She is now CEO of her own literary studio, Breathing Space Creative, and she works as an associate literary agent with me at the Transatlantic Agency. Shailene often gives talks about home, belonging, and belief, inclusivity, and community building through authentic storytelling. Shailene's work as a space maker and her commitment to author care is why I felt it was critical for her to be part of this conversation. Even in the work that I've done with her, I see how she's always putting the needs of the clients to the forefront and really thinking about how the writer can be centered through the entire publishing process. So I'm so excited to be in conversation with these brilliant women. And that's exactly what this will be. We can't see your faces, so we don't feel beholden to you as we normally would. So this is going to be a conversation between us, really talking about our experiences, about things that went really well and things that didn't, and how perhaps the industry can do better. Awesome. Ladies, I want to start by asking you for opening thoughts about this topic and some of the things that we definitely want to touch on. I know I have pre-prepared questions, but I want to open the floor to you to say, what are the things you really want to explore in our conversation today?
Love it. I love it. First, I have to say, I'm so excited to hold space with both of you. Like, this already feels really nourishing. It feels good. So that's the first thing I'd like to put out there. And then there's so many things I want to discuss. And I think for me, the main thing being, I would love to share my experiences and talk a little bit about the things that I've seen, the things I've done, the things that have went incredibly well for me as an author, and then maybe not so much, and try to see if this discussion and these experiences that we're bringing forth can then blossom into possible solutions, or at least things worth having conversations, at a different table later on. So that's kind of where I'm at, but I'm open to everything that you both have to bring to the table today.
Mm-hmm. Nothing to add. So well said. You must be a writer.
Oh, maybe. Perhaps.
Amazing. In that case, Anahid, I'd like to start with you. In the time since that book tour, the one you wrote about in your piece that left such a sour taste in your mouth, what has your experience been as a racialized author?
Yeah, it's a good question. I come into this conversation wearing a couple of hats. One is as the experience of author, which I wrote about in the article, and the other is having the honor of getting to work in different sectors, doing diversity and inclusion work. And my sense is from that latter perspective that I think the publishing industry is a couple steps behind where a lot of other industries are at in tackling issues of equity and inclusion, particularly around racial diversity. I think the bench, the motivation has certainly increased because of anti-Black racism and the protests and all of that, like for many, many sectors and industries. But to answer your question, I guess, it feels important for me to just say that the discrimination and even the manifestation of racism within publishing, I don't think is the overt form. And that's really important to name. In other words, it's good people, well-intentioned people, unconsciously perpetuating what they see and know, what's familiar, and marginalizing or the unfamiliar or what is unknown. And so just the starting point for me in this conversation is, and all of what I described in the article is unintentional and more impactful in a way, because when it's unintentional, it can be invisible and it can be hard to talk about or pinpoint. And I think what happened for myself, and I think happens for a lot of other BIPOC authors, is that it's not just one moment in time, it's an accumulation of small moments where you receive a message through or a signal in relationship with others in the industry, at writers' festivals, on panels, in media interviews, that you're underestimated, or you're not
treated the same way as your white counterparts, or you have to work harder to garner the same respect. All these small things that are, again, hard to sort of talk about. And so I'll finish my opening thing here with one of those micro moments that happened for me during my book tour, which I refer to in the article. And this was, I had at this point traveled to a number of cities, and there had been a few different things that had happened. And I returned to Toronto, and I was invited last minute to go to this glitzy writers event downtown. And I, threw on a dress, glammed up, got my hair done, shot downtown. And well, for those in the industry, it probably won't be that hard to identify, but the authors were placed at tables with a number of donors. I was placed at a table with where the donors were all happened to be all white folks. And I had, because at that point I was pretty burnt out, the travel, and of course, and this is an important thing to note, for many authors that are traveling, it's very hard to make an income just on writing. I don't know. I mean, I think the people that are able to do that, are few and far between. And so for myself, I actually took chunks of time off my day job where I was not receiving any income to be able to travel on behalf of my book. And I made a conscious choice to do that because I wanted to use it as an opportunity to talk about race and trauma and inclusion. And so, so I was happy to do that, but it was a lot of effort. And so I went to this event, and I had said to the organizer ahead of time, hey, I'm pretty tired. I just want to, am I going to be, what supports will be in place? I don't want to kind of have to be facilitating conversations with people that are unfamiliar with any of the ideas or concepts talked about in my book. And this person assured me, don't worry, you'll be at the table with the president and other folks, and you'll be supported, and they're thrilled to have you, and it'll be. And what I found was I was, I'll just cut to the chase. I actually didn't know who the head of the organization was until 3/4 of the way through the evening, when they were announced by someone on stage, and at this point stood up and waved, and then sat back down. And I felt that moment viscerally, because I thought, if this was a generation ago, and I think this is an easy comparison, in a predominantly male dominant publishing industry, and I was a sole female at the table, and to sort of be given assurance that no, the male president is looking forward to having you, and you're representing an important issue area and identity, and of course you're going to be. I mean, it's flabbergasting that this male president would at no point in time even acknowledge the sole female at the table. That's how that moment registered for me. It was, A, you're in a position of power. B, my role here is the sole author, and additionally, I'm a BIPOC author, and not once have you paused to introduce yourself, to say hello, or to position me or my book in this table of folks that are invited. And I felt like I just wanted to melt under the table. I felt so completely, as I've just said, underestimated, disrespected, and completely, and just knowing that if I was a big, important white name, that would never have happened. And again, that wasn't the only moment. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that, as a micro moment that happened.
I just want to say that's not a micro moment on hate. That is a very discouraging, to say the least, and minimizing way to feel at a place that we're supposed to be honored, right? If this event is similar to events I've been to, they often frame the authors as guests of honor, and that the author at the table is supposed to be like, when those tables are sold to sponsors, is you get to sit with such and such author. But you're not treated as that way. You weren't treated as the guest of honor that you are. And I'd like to flip it over to you, Shailene, and to talk a little bit about your experiences as an author, and then also your experiences as a publishing professional. But with the idea of the role of the author in the process, and the power an author, a racialized author, specifically minority authors, people who are queer, people who are disabled, people who are from religious minorities, how they are given agency, or how agency is withheld from them. Because I have thoughts, but I'd want to hear yours first.
Yeah, I think, for me, it really, like, we have to rewind and we have to go back to this notion of transparency. What assumptions do we make when we're putting these authors into these positions to then have to be showcased, and also are expected to perform in a particular way? So I think we have to think about transparency in that we need to first provide these authors with an explanation of what's going to unfold or what they think will unfold. I know if I'm going to be placed in a social situation, something, glitzy and glamorous, fair enough. But if I'm coming from a panel where I've just discussed the innermost traumatic childhood experiences that I document in my book, is there going to be a space in between that panel and then this social environment where I can kind of just reflect with myself and figure out how that went for me? Can I make a list of the things that I would love to have had during that panel or post panel? Like, I think we need to first offer that transparency. Here's how this event is going to go. That's an opportunity for the author to kind of step in and say, well, actually, I would need, a half an hour in between these things to be able to do this, right? So there needs to be an entry point into that conversation, I think, and it shouldn't be up to the author to have to instigate that, right? So if we're a festival organizer, if we're, planning something and we're going to be putting these authors into these situations, we really have to think about what the variables are, right? And there's never going to be one big solution that we can just insert. We really have to treat it as a case-by-case thing, right? So, like Anna had mentioned, what if the author is just, coming off the plane? They've just arrived. Are they going to be thrust into, being put on stage? Is there a moment to eat? Is there a moment to have a glass of water? Like, these basic things, right? They're so important, but they build up and they matter. We can rewind even further and think about funding. So how do these festivals get the money to put these events on? What information is being offered to the funders? Are we talking about author care at that level, at that point? And having been on many a granting jury, these are the conversations that I bring up. And I'm often met with looks of author care. Well, what's that? Like, we don't want to talk about that. We want to talk about what the event is and who's going to be there. But if we're going to be funding these events and these festivals and these fantastic conferences that we all love, we have to think about what space is being made for the authors to do their work at their best, right? So all these little variables, there's just so many things, but it really comes down to transparency and just trying your best, I think, as an organizer to prepare the author. And I think that can be done on the publishing side as well. Like, when we're signing authors, we're bringing them into our publishing home. What information are we giving them about the life cycle of this book? What's to be expected once that book is out there in the universe? What's going to happen then? And again, it's all these different variables, because there will not be a one-size-fits-all solution to offer. So I think, I have so many experiences that I can bring to the table. And having been a festival organizer and being brand new to it, having no template to work from and saying, okay, I'm going to build this thing. I have a lot of help, but there are just so many things that we missed. There are so many things that we did wrong. But I think it's that idea of going back to the table, having conversations, discussing all of the things that went wrong, and trying to come up with new ways to approach it. I think that's where the change starts. It's that idea of acknowledging and then going back and trying to figure out, what can we do to grow as an organization, but also what can we do to make sure these things don't continue to happen. So a long-winded answer, but yeah, I think we're really, we really need to think about that idea of transparency. I don't know, it's a word I tend to throw around a lot, but it's just so important in so many different facets of publishing, right?
I agree. I think about how you're saying how we can keep rewinding and going back further and further until we reach the root of what some of these issues are. And for me, I think at least part of it is how we conceive of the writer and their role in the publishing industry. I often see discussions of publishing with the writer outside of the industry, and the publishing machine being something that happens around the writer, that happens to the writer, but not with the writer. I also I'm going to rein myself in, but I also see this as a function of our capitalist system, right? That sees products and commodities and not people, and how that is then layered on top of people's existing marginalized identities. So if you already take a person who is dehumanized in so many other aspects of their life, and then take them and try to turn them into a product and a commodity, how further humiliating that can be. I grapple with this idea of what agency and power do we give the author to participate in processes. I see writers on TikTok often doing their thing, trying to capitalize on the new social media platform. And a few of them make little vids about how little power authors have in the process, right? It's like, here are all the things that authors don't control. And they're like, boom, but don't control that, don't control that, don't control that, don't control that, don't control anything. And it's cute and funny, but is it? There are many reasons and many things that the publisher is in charge of, for good reason, right? I always talk to writers about the only reason to publish with a publishing house instead of self-publishing is because the publisher is supposed to be an expert at things that you cannot do. So for the things that they are an expert at, obviously they should take control there. But I wonder how far that extends, and how often the author is dismissed with the words, that's just how it's done. You don't understand how publishing works. That's not how things go. Do some research. So I'm curious to hear from both of you, in your experiences, requests that maybe sound unreasonable to the publishing industry that are quite easy and there's no reason why we can't change them, or solutions that would really center the needs of the author that for some reason we haven't made standard practice yet. Are there some things, for example, Anahid, that you felt if they were in place already, maybe you would have had a better experience during your book tour and not have come away feeling so drained and disheartened?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's so much to say, and it's such a short amount of time. I will say I have empathy for the publishing industry, especially in the midst of this pandemic. I know many publishers are struggling to stay financially afloat, which makes any kind of change more difficult. And at the same time, in some ways more important, because there's an opportunity in the midst of this chaos to bring in more focus on what to change. I think it's really important to say that creating more inclusion is a competency. And going back to what I was saying earlier and what Shailene was saying, it's, having good intention isn't enough. It's really about being able to recognize, and as you said earlier, Leonika, how power manifests. How to recognize power in relationship with authors in the industry. There's a whole political analysis, and then there's policies and strategies, and then there's how that comes out in behavior. And so at the very least, to invest in equity, diversity training, certainly for leaders in the publishing industry, agencies, as well as I think festival leaders would be a huge shift. And the second way I would answer that question is to say that I think the barriers to creating more inclusion are not cognitive. And that's the easy place for a lot of people to go, is just, I'm going to throw out this diversity policy. Or we saw this after anti-Black racism protests, right? We're going to throw out this statement. I don't know how many organizations we got calls for saying, can you help us write a statement? And then the response was, and then what happens after? What do you do? You know, like, it's, the words are always easy. The policies are always easy. Any of us can sit and Google diversity policy or anti-harassment policy or workplace health, but shifting the culture, shifting the behaviors is a lot harder. And this is such emotional terrain for many, for those of us that are on the experiencing end, but also, you know I've also made mistakes around other identities, and that work of looking at myself and what needs to shift is emotional and is very challenging to do. So that's a skill set as well, right? The emotional literacy to also lean into relationship and give feedback and have the brave conversations. And I think about, when I was sharing my experience earlier, and Leonika, what you did, I actually had a moment of feeling my chest open and tears coming up. And I thought, my God, what's happening? And I realized, I think this is the first time where I've shared that publicly, and anyone has ever leaned in and affirmed my experience in a way that feels like they're partnering with me. And that's the emotional skill set that I'm talking about. That's part of this work. Cognitively, I know you understand the analysis around this. So you have the frame to be able to put that experience into context. But B, you also have the emotional skill set to know the impact of that and to lean in. And wow, like that really, even for somebody that does this work, for me personally, that just landed in a completely different way. And I know, without you and I knowing each other prior to this session, that you're an ally. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. And I want to take all of that, everything that you've said, and put it in a basket and hug it. Like, this is the conversation that, I try to bring to the surface. Like, what is it that's important to the author? Right? We have to always go back to that idea and that notion. And I use myself as an example. And one thing that is incredibly important to me is communication. I need to always know what's happening. If I am sitting amongst radio silence, I get nervous, I get anxious, I start second guessing whether or not my spot at the table was a mistake. Is this space really for me? Is somebody in contact with me? Are they answering my questions? You know what I mean? But it's also that idea of creating an entry point into that again, and making the author feel like there's a space for them to ask these questions. So communication for me would be number one. But again, this could be different for every author, whether you're a marginalized author, whether you're writing about trauma or not. We have to get down to the root of things and ask authors what they need. And I think, for me, I think about, like you said, what happens on the other end, what happens after. So we're so into these veneers or these temporary Band-Aid type solutions, but they're not really doing anything. When I think about the space that I hold in publishing now, I ask myself, how did I get here? I've inherited and earned a ton of privilege that I did not have a couple of years ago, right? So I've got these different vantage points now as an author. I can see through the black hole, right? So there's this mystery that happens once you hand off your manuscript and it's going through production. I can see all the steps now because I've gained the privilege of seeing things from an editor's perspective, seeing things from an agent perspective. I can see and fill in all the gaps. I can do that myself, so I may not need that additional help. But you might have an author coming in who also, like me, is super anxious, needs to know what's happening, but is too afraid to speak up and ask, for these things. Or maybe the publisher on the other end is then making the assumption that this person knows they're good. I don't have to step in. I don't have to offer anything. So there's this like break in the communication that I think we need to address and to fill. And if we're putting people in specific positions, we have to ask ourselves, what now? Now that they're here, we've done the work, we brought them in, what are we going to do to support this person so that they can hold this space for a long time and hold it in a way that is healthy for them? So that's another thing. I can use my own experience as an agent to fill in the gaps here. It took a long time for me to figure out if I could do this role. And I said, listen, you're not going to have a ton of money coming in. How am I going to support myself? Is it the right time in my personal life? All these different variables. But I got to have that conversation with my boss and say, like, look, I'm very, very interested in this, but here's what I'm going through. Here's the situation, right? To be able to have those conversations and then together work through these issues and come to a solution that will work just for me. It might not work for the next BIPOC associate agent coming into this position, but it worked for me and we came to the solution together. And knowing that we can constantly go back, reevaluate, Shalene, is this still working for you 6 months down the road? Actually, no, it's not. We're gonna have to figure something else out. No problem, let's go ahead and do that, right? So it's that idea of putting someone in a position, figuring out what's going to work for them in that moment, and then going back and being open to rejigging and pivoting. And I think if COVID has taught us anything, we better figure out how to pivot and how to do so in a sustainable way. So this idea of equity, I always say, well, what does that even mean? Like, what does that mean to you as an individual? For me, it's about having a healthy relationship with the career that I've chosen and having a healthy career, a healthy relationship with my writing, having all these different hats. You don't want any one of them to just fall to the wayside, right? Like you want to be able to hold them in a really healthy way. So I think we all play a role in making sure that authors can do that. Because I think, like what was mentioned before, it's not common for writers to make their income solely from writing. So we know this, this is something that is out there, right? So how do we then provide support for authors so that they can do these other pockets of project work in a way that is, healthy, and then they can continue to focus on the writing. So there's all these different branches on the tree that we have to pay close attention to, right? We got to water the tree a little bit.
For sure. You said so much there, both of you. And so I was quickly jotting down notes and keywords that I want to tease out before we take a look to see if there are any questions from the audience. You mentioned fear and the fear the author may have. And I feel like there are, I want to dig into that fear because I have ideas about where that comes from. And as an agent, I see that fear a lot. I see it in query letters of this very, please, 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 give me a chance. I see it when I go to writing conferences. It's almost, I feel like writers think they have to kiss the ring to get a chance. And all writers, I feel this way. And then writers who are marginalized feel like they have to kiss the ring, but also hide any pain or any difficulty or any challenges because of their identity that the society places on them. They have to mask that and not make extra trouble. And so I try to think of how can I remove that idea that I can make or break somebody's career, that I'm a kingmaker. I am encouraged by seeing more and more conversations among writers about what the role of an agent is and how publishing works, and really them empowering themselves to understand what their role is and how they relate to agents and why having no agent is better than having bad agent and things like that. But I want to tease out that fear and how the convoluted nature of publishing entrenches that fear, and how the lack of transparency and the lack of communication and the radio silence for a long time of the need to know basis idea entrenches that fear and really makes it so that the power stays in the hands of the industry, and the writer feels like they can't speak up, or else the opportunity will be taken away, that they've been given a seat at the table, but that seat can quickly be removed. That's my perception as somebody working within the industry, and a perception that I try to dispel by posting pictures of myself in my PJs as often as possible. This is who's reading your queries. But can we talk about more structural ways that we can dispel this fear?
Oh, yes. And definitely, I love your a day in the life of. Like, you create this persona on Instagram that is approachable, accessible. We know you, we know the you. And I think that's part of it as well, is we create, or these roles traditionally have been held up here. These are the unattainable people that we could never touch, we could never have a conversation with, which, is so far from the truth. So if we let a little bit of ourselves out there into the world, the writers see that we are human as well. We are dealing with a lot of the same things that they're dealing with. So, my experience as an author, I had all of these fears. I still have some of these fears. They do not disappear, right? This idea of not knowing what's going to happen or not understanding a process. So in the way that I try to remove that, especially when I'm working with writers, is, okay, what's important to you? Like, what is your biggest dream? Like, who are you? I want to find out everything about them. And then I want to share my experiences with them. Yes, I have this professional relationship, but also I want to let you know what I did in response to a particular experience. Maybe that's going to be helpful for you. I want to explain what's going to happen now that I'm holding your manuscript. Here's what I'm personally going to be doing with it. How do you communicate? Do you want me to constantly email you? Because I will, because I like communication. Will that make you nervous if I constantly email you? Because then I will pull that back. So I think it's this balance between taking your own experiences, getting to know the person on the other side, and then creating or custom building a way of reducing, shrinking the fear, shrinking it down to a manageable size where you can put it in your pocket, because it's never going to go away. This idea of the temporary opportunity is sitting on my shoulder every minute. I can kind of see it and hear it there, right? It's like, well, we've given this position to Shalene. We've given her this opportunity. In the back of my mind, I'm like, am I the best person for this? Wait a minute. Maybe I shouldn't do this. Maybe I shouldn't hold this space, right? But now I'm able to kind of quiet that a bit. I have tools and resources to hush that up, but it is still there. And I think we need people to understand that these fears are coming in for a particular reason. And we need to find ways to work with the individual to then, offer that whispering fear almost. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of how I approach it. And then I ask for feedback. Like, is this really working for you? Is this relationship working for you in this way? One thing that I struggled with when I was a festival director, flip my hat over a little bit here, I didn't really have an opportunity to receive feedback. Like, how am I doing in this role? Is this actually what I'm supposed to be doing? There was no one to get that information from. And so how do I grow in a position or in a role? How do I stretch? How do I have a rubric almost to work against? And when you don't have that, you're kind of fumbling, right? So I think even providing resources and truth and transparency around how to evaluate the work that you're doing, whether that's as a writer, an author, or on the other side. Like, how do we know we're doing okay? Who do we talk to about these things? So that, that string of fear is always kind of dangling behind, just following. But I think we have to figure out how to talk to it and how to manage it, I think, because it's not going anywhere. We can't say we can totally erase fear, because we
For
cannot.
sure.
Yeah.
Ahead, thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the publishing industry as a whole needs a heck of a lot more imagination. Like really to think about like, how do we use the more diverse authors coming in the doors to market beyond our usual demographic? And certainly here in Canada, I feel like it's the middle class, progressive, liberal, white kind of majority, mostly female. And like, I think there's but it takes thinking out of the box. And I know I had a couple conversations around my manuscript when I was first shopping it around, just about market saturation, like as if the stories from women of color are sort of a niche thing over here, as opposed to, and we have to get out of these boxes. Like I think, and especially with demographics changing, there's huge opportunity. That's one thing. Just in terms of some of the things I think about on an industry level, I think transparency, and both of you have talked about this in different ways. Well, let me back up for a second. I think when authors are choosing a place to put their manuscript, whether it's an agent or publisher or a publicist or whomever, there's signals that we look for. And some of the signals I'll just pull out here because there's many, but for me, like transparency, and you don't have to be at the place where you're experts in inclusion or have a completely diversified staff. I mean, that's the ultimate, hopefully, end goal, but I know many organizations are somewhere in progress towards that point. But there's a way of just being transparent. We are committed to equity. Here's where we are right now on our journey around it. We recognize that you're a racialized author coming in a predominantly white industry, and that, like, languaging, knowing that there's awareness around it, signals to me like there's responsibility, and there's an opening to have honest conversations around the gap around identity and power. The second piece I would say is, as you pointed out, Shailene, like support. I felt like once the book came out for me, I was cast out. I was just so, and you talked about this as well, so isolated. And it was, and I've learned, partially because of my identity, that I have to, as a woman of color, as a first-gen immigrant, it's not to ask for help, to reveal weakness is a liability. And so I'm not good at reaching out for help. I didn't know how to do that. And I didn't feel like there was any point at that process of traveling and speaking and being in front of media. I remember one morning I did 3 media interviews, and yes, I'm lucky to have them, but still, from 6 a.m. to 7, and then I traveled from one place to another point. I was on the prairies, and it was very few people in the audience looked like me, and there was no one to. Luckily, I have a supportive partner who took, sometimes multiple calls through the day, but it would have been so meaningful to have somebody in my publishing house or in the industry just reaching out. And I guess the third signal that would make a difference that would be important is advocacy. People that are allies, again, at different points, that are advocating on a systemic level the need for a languaging, so that it doesn't fall on the shoulders continuously of underrepresented authors.
Right.
And as I'll bring in another role. I'm currently on the equity committee for the Writers Union. And I have to say, I feel like, again, it's representative of the role that BIPOC authors play, like, that isolation happens in the equity committee. Like, I don't think we've ever been contacted by the National Council. Like, it feels like we're pitching ideas into the void. So I guess the message I would say to people in the industry is that these conversations aren't going to kill us. What will kill us is a continuing divides. So how do we all lean in and build relationship across these differences? And it's not always going to be easy, but you know what? Occupying the role of a marginalized author or player in the industry is never easy. So we're used to it. It's really about other people recognizing, like, embracing that discomfort as well. And we all got to be part of building stronger relationships here, because the future of the industry, I think, depends in large part around figuring out how to do this inclusion piece better, a hell of a lot better.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. As we go into the Q&A session, I've been looking at the questions and I've picked a few that I think would really dovetail beautifully with our topics. I might keep some of the questions, and maybe if our panelists and I are feeling generous, we'll answer them in another format if we feel like it. No promises. But I do want to end on this one note. The thought that came to my mind, and maybe it's because I come from a tradition and a culture that really values storytellers, where the storyteller is a honored position, it is a revered person. And I think publishing as it currently stands loves stories, but doesn't quite show its love to the storytellers. And I think if you go into every interaction thinking, how can I show love and reverence to the storyteller, it will absolutely impact the choices that you make. Not saying that they'll be perfect choices, but they'll be better choices and they'll be more open to correction. So diving into these questions, because we're running low on time. One I thought was really great is a question from someone who asks, when working with an editor on a project that explores trauma, what did your editor do or not do to support you so that the editing experience wasn't re-traumatizing? Or what would you like from an editor in that situation for both?
Yeah, a question worthy of deep thought. I try to rewind and think about my personal experiences, but also putting on my editor hat and thinking about that as well. I think for me as an author, what I found incredibly helpful in writing my memoir was, one, being encouraged to explore the container that worked best for my story. So, my story was not pushed and pressed into this traditional template. My publisher said, you should explore the container that works best for you, and we will support you in whatever way the story then lands on the page. Phew, that was already a big relief to be able to do that. And then to say, like, do you have any ideas in terms of, what the editor relationship will look like for you? I was lucky enough to be in the same city as my editor, so we got to have face-to-face meetings, which was so important to me, and having a woman of color editor was important to me. So having all of those things line up and being able to talk about and face-to-face, being able to talk about my experiences without it being like, and this happened to you, and then this and this. It was more like, let's talk about the experience itself. Let's remove you from it and discuss it as it exists. For me, it was an incredibly nourishing experience to have support like that. And so now that standard has been set, that is what I am after in terms of, future editorial relationships. I want to have that. I want to have that support. And I felt like, I was empowered to now demand that. And I don't see myself settling for less. It's like, here's how this is going to work for me. So it's also on the other side, like, can we as authors, as marginalized authors, can we assert ourselves into these positions or in these positions and say, here's what I need. Here's how this is going to work, right? And I feel like I can now do that, where maybe 5-6 years ago, it's like, ooh, I'm just going to, nervously enter into this. But having that kind of a relationship with an editor, incredibly important for diving into work that is not easy, right? And I've had people say, things like, oh, it must have been like therapy writing out all of this. No, not at all. It's not like that at all. Like, what? I don't know, not even close. But and then like just kind of thinking like, what can we do on the other side of it? Always thinking ahead. And for me, like being asked what I want to talk about, whoosh, tears coming out. You mean I get to choose? You mean I don't have to talk about the contents of the book all the time, that I could talk about craft, that I could pitch an idea for hybrid containers and why that's exciting to me as an author. Really, I can do that. So I mean, all of these different things add to the experience and help me to figure out what an important, healthy editor author relationship looks like or can look like. So
Excellent.
hoping that my future books are, have that same experience. So
well, I
we'll
think
see.
what you said about asserting yourself is important. You don't have to hope, you can demand that this is the type of editorial relationship I need in order to produce my best work. And that is part of the conversation about whether or not you get to publish my book. Ani, do you want to address that question? Because I have another question that I think could work well for you as well, if you wanted to.
I'll very briefly. My editor sent the signal early on that it was that he saw me. And before he became my editor, I had sent an earlier version of the manuscript to their publishing house. Well, it's in the book, so it's Anansi. And they declined it on the first go around, but he sent such a generous email giving feedback around it that I went back. And even though I had more than their offer on the manuscript, I went with them because I felt like there was rapport with him, and it was lovely. Always felt welcomed when I visited the publisher, like their location, and coffee and talks. And so I think it's really important that you find the right. I would second what Shailene's saying, and kind of to feel free to shop around.
Agreed. Another great question I see here is about conflicts between different marginalized communities, right? Often these conversations are about how majority populations impact racialized or minority populations, but this person writes, as both an author and a publishing professional, I've been caught up in a few times in conflicts that occur among people of different marginalized identities. Any suggestions for navigating with these situations without unintentionally causing more harm? Do you want to start with that one, Anahid?
That's part of the skill set piece. It's hard to kind of give one definite answer, because navigating situations like that, I think requires literacy around systemic power and oppression generally, but B, the specifics and the nuances that are particular to each form of oppression, because racism is different, than transphobia is different than sexism, et cetera. And then what are the specifics of this particular situation? And so there's and then there's conflict competency that's a part of this, right? And so I would say the investment in, when I was talking about earlier, skill development, this would be exactly the situation to apply it to. And it's tough. And the second piece I would say is that political correctness is not the right skill set. Political correctness is based on, here's the set of rules, but emotionally, people apply it often from a frozen place. Like, I'm so afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing that I actually lose my inner fluidity to actually kind of be able to, as opposed to like what I'm describing is, I have enough competency around the analysis and my like the emotional orientation that I see a number of options of how to respond. So much happening. And so therefore I can choose the right one. I'm never locked into one mode. And people too often in any industry get locked in around issues of inclusion and equity. And it's like nothing, and often make it worse for everybody involved, because I'm trying to apply this one set of rules that I learned in that workshop 5 years ago, or what I saw on the internet, and I'm doing it in a way that's so super awkward, and then everybody else gets super afraid and awkward as well, and now we've just escalated this small little situation into something that is rippling out beyond what is. And the other thing I would say is, if you're not sure, reach out to people that know something about these issues and get support.
Call in community. It's about calling in, right? And when I think about these conflicts that happen, I think some people make the assumption, well, it's always going to be people of color and then white people. No, these things happen within communities as well.
Absolutely.
And I think we have to figure out, we have to stop. When something happens, we stop. We think, okay, what's going on here? Let's figure out what this is. What is this really about? Let's find a way to discuss. Let's slow down. Let's not go on Twitter and Instagram and put it out into the universe. Let's stop. Let's call each other in and privately discuss what what happened and what did it cause, what ripple is starting to form right now, and let's stop it there before it becomes something bigger. So it's that idea of calling in. And I'll see things on Twitter and they are just kind of growing, and I'm like, oh my gosh, do I jump into this hamster wheel and continue to spin with everybody, or do I behind the scenes do my activism? Do I pull back and do the work that nobody sees? Not getting credit for this, but I'm going to go ahead and reach out in a way that's going to be nourishing to the people who are experiencing this. That's kind of how I try to operate. So I think we need to think about that as well, and not trying to quickly, throw people under the bus, because that never ends well. I've not seen it end well yet. So it's that idea of figuring out what's happening and trying to talk to each other and sharing, thoughts in a way where we can hear the tone in each other's voice is so important. That's why I try not to jump on Twitter, because you can't hear, you can't hear the emotion in someone's voice. You can't hear a quiver. You can't hear, this is what this situation did to me, and here's what I hope we can do in order to rectify, right? So these conversations, I think that's where we want to start. Definitely not easy. Definitely not going to be, you jump in, everything's great, let's move on. Like, this is a journey. But I like what you said, Anahit, about sharing that journey. Like, what have you done to date? Like, what is your end goal? Where are you in this journey? Like, that experience, I think, is really important as well. Just talking about where you are, what stumbling blocks you hit. Someone might raise their hand and say, hey, I have a resource that happened to us. Here's what we did, right? So it's creating positive conversation, which organically will present solutions worthy of being tried, right? So that's kind of my approach for that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. I know we have 2 minutes left. I know there are some wrap up the Tech Forum team wants to do, but I do want to ask this final question. So lightning round. How can authors give feedback to publishers, festival organizers, the industry in a way that doesn't compromise them? This may have been in reaction to what I said about that fear and about not wanting to lose position. So keeping in mind that authors don't want to lose opportunities, but also need to assert themselves and make sure they express their needs and express when they need something different. How can authors give feedback in a constructive way?
It's a toughie. It's one I think I'll talk for an hour about, but I'll try not to. I think just, again, that reflection time. So knowing what I know about myself, I'm a very slow processor. I don't have answers immediately. I have to sit and think. So telling the author to allow themselves half an hour post-event to really debrief what went well, what didn't go so well, and then leave it alone. Bring it back out a week later, reevaluate. Let me see how I feel now after processing all of that. Wait, this actually was really fantastic. It was just me being nervous. Cool. Not going to really move ahead. But if those feelings are still there and they are tugging at you, then you work, on a, maybe you're working on a Google Doc or something just to get your feelings out. How am I going to then communicate this to the organizers? But it's important to definitely let folks know if something didn't go well. They need to know that, because they need to brainstorm ideas, but also offering possible solutions, I think, is a really great way to communicate, saying this didn't go so well. You might want to try maybe one of these 5 things, and then, kind of try to be a part of the solution yourself as well as the author. So that's kind of my fast
Good job.
And I'm going to answer it in one sentence. You got to be open to the feedback if you're asking for it. I gave feedback probably to a good handful of leaders of different events that had where there had been incidents like the moment I described to you, because those micro moments reflect the macro culture. And so I wanted to use my skill set and privilege as I was moving to just just raise awareness. And I think I did it in a really respectful, relational way. I hope you have a sense of like who I am being on the call here. And I don't think any one of those conversations was there a leaning in or, oh, thank you for the feedback. So don't ask for it if we're not ready to act on it. That's key.
Love it. I think that sums it up, because that has been my gripe for a long time. I don't want to be asked questions, asked how we can improve if you're not going to apply anything. So I love that, Anahid. Don't ask for it if you're not going to do anything with it. I want to thank Tech Forum so much for inviting us to this call, and hand it back to Ainsley to do her wrap up.
Thank you. So a big thank you to Anahid, Shalene, and Leonika for this fantastic conversation. You've given everyone who attended and everyone who will watch this recording so much to reflect on. So thank you very much for joining us at this year's Tech Forum. We really appreciated having you. And we'd also like to thank the Department of Canadian Heritage for their support through the Canada Book Fund. And thanks again to Anahid, Shalene, and Leonika, and to all of you for attending.
Thanks for organizing this. Thanks, Leonika.
Thanks,
you,
everybody.
Thank
Fantastic.
you. Yeah.